Story number 1.
I had always been the kind of person who loved peace and quiet. The hustle and bustle of everyday life would often wear me down, so I welcomed moments of solitude when they came. It wasn't often that I was completely alone at home, but that Friday night, I was. My family had left for a weekend trip, leaving me behind to take care of the house and enjoy some time to myself. It was around 8 p.m. when they left, and after seeing them off, I had settled into a comfortable routine. I grabbed a book and a cup of tea, planning to spend the night reading, with no distractions. The house was an old two-story with creaky wooden floors and the kind of charm that came from age. I'd lived there for years, and nothing unusual had ever happened. In fact, I loved the house. Its quirks and imperfections felt like home. By 10:30 p.m., I had finished my tea and was about to head to bed. That's when I first heard it. A faint sound, almost like a low thud, coming from upstairs. I froze, my hand still holding the edge of the book. For a moment, I tried to reason it away. Old houses made noises, after all. Maybe something had fallen over or the house was settling. I let it go, but then the sound came again. A bit louder this time. Thud! Thud! I placed my book down and stood up, feeling an odd tightness in my chest. I looked toward the stairs, the hallway leading to the second floor in the distance. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, but another part, the more cautious part, urged me to check. It wasn't like there was anyone else in the house. The door was locked, the windows were secure. I had checked them earlier in the evening. Still, something didn't feel right. I walked over to the stairs, my steps tentative. The house was unnervingly quiet now, save for the faint sound of my own breathing. I stood at the foot of the stairs, listening intently. There was no more thudding, just silence. Maybe I had imagined it, but before I could turn around, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak. It came from upstairs. I froze, my pulse quickening. This time, it wasn't a simple thud. It was a footstep, light but distinct, as if someone was walking around up there. My heart thudded in my chest. No one was supposed to be in the house. A flood of thoughts rushed through my mind. Was I hearing things? Had I left a door open by mistake? Or worse, was someone actually inside the house? I slowly made my way upstairs, my feet almost soundless on the old floorboards. As I approached the top of the stairs, I was aware of every small sound, the creak of the wood beneath me, the slight rustle of my clothes, my breath quickening. I felt like I was walking in slow motion, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The hallway was dark. I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. The light flickered a moment before fully illuminating the corridor. Everything looked normal. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything unusual. The doors to the bedrooms were all shut, and nothing seemed out of place. But as I walked down the hallway, the floor creaked again. It was as if someone was following me, their footsteps just behind mine. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Only empty rooms. I checked my parents' bedroom, then my own. I made sure everything was locked, everything was in place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few minutes of pacing, I returned downstairs. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the house was settling more than usual tonight. I tried to rationalize it, but the tension in the air wouldn't go away. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as I settled back into my seat, trying to distract myself with the TV. But the sense of being watched never left. It was like there was something in the house with me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing in the hallway, but there was nothing. I was starting to get paranoid. The more I thought about it, the more I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the TV show I had on, but it wasn't helping. The feeling only intensified. Around midnight, I decided I'd had enough of being alone. I texted a friend asking if they wanted to hang out, but no one responded. I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to worry them. I tried to get some sleep, but every creak of the house, every draft in the air kept me awake. I finally dozed off, only to be awakened by the sound of something tapping on my window. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I lay there for a moment, frozen, listening. The tapping came again, soft, rhythmic, like someone was knocking on the window. I could feel the weight of the silence around me as I slowly got out of bed and approached the window. I was trying to steady my breath, my mind racing with 1,000 possible explanations. Was it a branch? A bird? Maybe a neighbor? I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The yard was empty. The wind gently swayed the branches of the tree outside, but that was it. My pulse was still racing, my chest tight. I closed the curtain, but as I turned around, I heard it again, a light knock. Coming from the direction of the kitchen, I stood there staring toward the kitchen door, which was now ajar. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could think, I was moving toward it, my legs feeling like lead. I reached the kitchen and switched on the light. The room was empty, just as I had left it. But then I saw it. A small puddle of water on the floor, as if something had dripped from the ceiling. I glanced up, but there was no leak, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I stood still for a long time, staring at the water, trying to make sense of it. A few drops of water. No explanation. But the air felt thick, and my anxiety grew with each passing second. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. I ran out of the kitchen, my heart pounding. I reached the stairs just in time to hear something fall over in the hallway. I wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded like a heavy object. My breath caught in my throat as I stood at the base of the stairs, paralyzed by fear. There was no way I was going up there alone. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom, hoping she would pick up, hoping she could offer some rational explanation for everything that was happening. The phone rang twice, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried my dad. Same result. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from my friend, "Sorry, I fell asleep. What's up?" I didn't reply. I was too busy staring up at the top of the stairs. The silence in the house felt heavy, suffocating. That's when I heard it again. A whisper. Low and soft, like a breath against my ear. "Come upstairs." I froze, terror gripping me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring up at the empty hallway, feeling like I was being pulled into the darkness. The house was silent again, except for the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I ran. I didn't care if I looked foolish. I didn't care if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and left. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the house. I never returned. My parents came home to find the house just as I'd left it, but they never understood why I refused to stay there again. I couldn't explain it. Not the whispers, the knocking, the feeling of being watched. All I knew was that something was in that house, and it wasn't supposed to be. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was a Friday evening when my parents left for a weekend getaway. They had been planning this trip for months, so when the day finally arrived, I found myself alone in the house for the first time in a long while. My brother was off with friends, and I was left to enjoy the solitude. At first, I was excited. I had the house to myself, a rare treat in our busy family home. I could watch whatever I wanted on TV, stay up as late as I wanted, and eat whatever I wanted. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. My parents' absence seemed to echo through the empty rooms, but I didn't mind. I liked the stillness. I spent the evening on the couch, flipping through channels. After a while, I grew bored and decided to get a little fresh air. The night was chilly, and the wind howled softly outside, making the trees in our front yard sway and groan. I stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and sat on the steps, looking out at the dark street. It was peaceful, almost serene. But then I heard something, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't. It sounded like a voice, low and unintelligible, coming from inside the house. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I turned and walked back inside, glancing around the darkened living room. The house was empty, I was sure of it. I checked the windows, made sure all the doors were locked, and even double-checked the security system. Everything was in place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went to bed around midnight, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The silence of the house was almost suffocating, and every creak and groan made me jump. I pulled the covers up around me and tried to fall asleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. My heart pounded in my chest and my body was coated in a cold sweat. I couldn't explain why, but I felt as if something was watching me. The darkness of my room felt oppressive, as if it was closing in on me. I sat up in bed, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the window. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, the soft whispering. It was coming from downstairs. I froze. The voice was faint, but distinct. It sounded like it was calling my name, but I couldn't understand the rest of the words. My body went rigid, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just the wind or the house settling. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my phone from the nightstand. I texted my parents, but of course they didn't respond. They were probably fast asleep on their trip. My fingers trembled as I typed out a message to my brother, asking if he had come home without telling me. The message went unanswered. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. I had to investigate. Every step I took toward the stairs felt like it took an eternity. The air felt colder, heavier. The house was still, but it seemed like it was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I looked around the darkened living room. Everything appeared normal, but the whispering continued. It was louder now, almost urgent. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. The whispering came again, louder this time. Help! It was unmistakable. The voice was coming from the kitchen. I swallowed hard and slowly made my way toward the source. As I entered the kitchen, the temperature dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air. I flicked on the light, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing out of place. No one was there. But the whispering continued. It seemed to be coming from the pantry, the door slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I should go back upstairs, lock myself in my room, and call the police. But some strange force, pulled me toward that pantry door. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the whispering stopped. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of dread course through me, and yanked the door open. Nothing. It was empty. Just a few cans of food and some old boxes. But then I saw it. At the back of the pantry on the floor was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my hands shaking. As I unfolded it, I realized it was a letter, written in hurried, shaky handwriting. It was dated several years ago. Please. It read, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to fix it. It wasn't supposed to happen. I'm sorry. I stared at the letter, my mind racing. What was this? Why was it here? The air in the room grew colder, and the whispering returned, this time more insistent. Help me. I dropped the letter and stumbled back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I ran out of the kitchen, back toward the stairs, and hurried up to my room, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the panic rising in my chest. It was just some old letter I told myself wasn't anything to be afraid of, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. The whispering was relentless, echoing through the house. I grabbed my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone. I dialed my best friend, but the line went straight to voicemail. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping, coming from the door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint at first, like a nail on wood. But then it became more pronounced, louder, as if someone was tapping on the door with increasing urgency. My mind raced. There was no one in the house. I was sure of it. I had checked every room, every corner. The tapping continued. I couldn't stay in there any longer. I ran downstairs, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the house. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I didn't care where I went, just as long as I was away from that house. I spent the rest of the night in my car, too afraid to go back inside. I didn't know what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. That whatever had been in that house, whatever was whispering, was still there, waiting. When my parents returned the next day, they found the house exactly as I had left it. Nothing was out of place. No signs of anyone else being there. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. I never went back into that house after that night. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was a quiet evening when Claire found herself alone in the house. Her parents were visiting her aunt in the city for the weekend, and she had planned to spend her time catching up on some studying. At 23, Claire had always enjoyed being home alone. It was a chance to have the house to herself, no interruptions, and just peace and quiet, or so she thought. The house was old, creaky, and had a history that her parents often told her about. Stories of previous owners, odd occurrences, and strange noises at night. Claire never really believed those stories. She always chalked them up to overactive imaginations or the quirks of an aging house. But tonight, as the sun set and the shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch, something about the place felt different. Claire had just finished her dinner when she heard the first sound, soft but distinct, coming from upstairs. It was the sound of something moving, the creak of floorboards as though someone was walking around. She frowned, setting her fork down. Her first thought was that it might be her cat, Luna, but then she remembered that Luna had gone missing a few days ago, and her parents had posted signs hoping to find her. The cat had been known to sneak into the attic, and Claire assumed that was where she'd wandered off to. But the sound she was hearing didn't sound like a cat. It was heavier, more deliberate. She stood up and walked toward the stairs, straining her ears. The noise stopped abruptly. The house was still again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine, but shrugged it off. It had to be the house settling. There was no other explanation. She went back to her meal, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation growing inside her. Later, as the evening wore on, Claire sat down in the living room to watch a movie. The rain had started to fall lightly outside, and the wind made the trees sway, causing the windows to rattle. It was cozy, and she could feel herself relaxing into the couch when, once again, she heard the sound. This time a little louder. A door opening upstairs. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She froze, staring at the staircase. She couldn't rationalize it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was clear as day someone was walking around upstairs, and it wasn't her. Her thoughts raced. Was there someone in the house? Had someone gotten in? But the doors and windows were locked. She was certain of that. Tentatively, Claire got up and grabbed the nearest object she could find, an old candle holder from the coffee table. She held it in front of her like a weapon as she made her way toward the stairs, her pulse hammering in her ears. The footsteps were slow now, as though someone was pacing back and forth upstairs. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice shaky. There was no response, only the sound of soft footfalls. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe it was just the house making those noises, amplified by the storm outside. She called out again, louder this time, but the only answer was silence. Her feet moved slowly up the stairs, every step creaking under her weight. The sound from above had stopped, but her nerves were on edge. She reached the top of the stairs and stood there for a moment, scanning the hallway. The only light in the house was from the dim hallway lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. She walked down the hall, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. She reached the door to her parents' bedroom, and her hand hovered over the doorknob. She was almost afraid to open it. What if there was someone inside? She pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. Nothing. It was quiet, too quiet. Summoning every ounce of courage, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Her breath escaped in a rush, but a part of her wasn't relieved. The door hadn't opened on its own. The house hadn't creaked to life with the wind. There was something more to it, something she couldn't explain. She stepped into the room, her eyes darting around, looking for anything out of place. There was nothing. The bed was perfectly made, and everything seemed just as it had been when her parents left. But then she noticed something on the floor, a small object near the dresser. It was an old photo frame, one that she knew had been on her parents' dresser before, but it had fallen and the glass was cracked. Claire bent down to pick it up, but as she did, she felt the distinct sensation of someone behind her, a cold breath against her neck. She spun around, the candle holder gripped tightly in her hand, but there was no one there. The door behind her slammed shut. Her heart raced and panic surged through her chest. She tried the door, but it was locked, like something or someone was holding it shut from the outside. Her breath caught in her throat. She banged on the door, calling out, her voice trembling, but there was no response. She turned back to the room, her mind racing, her eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no sign of anything or anyone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly. Claire could see her breath in the air, her hands trembling as she clutched the candle holder. It wasn't the storm. The air felt wrong, chillier than it should have been. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the coldness receded and the door flew open. Claire rushed out into the hallway, her heart thundering in her chest. The house was quiet again, the silence almost deafening after the chaos in the room. She ran down the stairs, her feet nearly tripping over the steps, and burst into the living room. The front door, which had been locked when she came inside, was now wide open. Claire didn't hesitate. She bolted outside into the rain, her clothes drenched in an instant. Her phone, which had been on the coffee table, was now missing. She couldn't think straight, her mind consumed by the terror that was now coursing through her veins. She ran into the street, her hands shaking violently, and made her way to the neighbor's house. When she knocked, they answered immediately, their faces filled with concern when they saw the state she was in. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Patel asked, pulling Claire inside. Claire tried to catch her breath, her voice trembling. I don't know. There was something in the house. Something. It felt real. I heard footsteps, and then the door slammed shut, and it got so cold. Mrs. Patel looked at her with a mix of confusion and sympathy. "Claire, your parents have lived here for over 20 years. No one's ever mentioned anything like that before." Claire shook her head, still too shaken to speak clearly. The wind howled outside, but she couldn't shake the feeling of something, or someone, still in that house. She spent the night with the neighbors, unable to return until her parents came back home. When they did, they checked every room, every closet, every corner, but they found nothing. That night, Claire stayed up, eyes wide open, staring at the dark shadows in the corners of her room. She could still feel the cold breath, the weight of being watched. And when she glanced at the mirror by her bed, she swore she saw something, someone, standing behind her. They were only visible for a split second before it vanished. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had always been comfortable with the idea of being home alone. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, especially living in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. My house, an old Victorian that had been in the family for generations, was familiar. The creaks of the old wooden floors, the hum of the ancient furnace, and the soft wind rattling the windows. I had grown up with those sounds. They were part of the background, the symphony of a house with a long history. But that particular night, something changed. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend. They'd left early Friday morning, and I had the entire house to myself. The plan was simple. I'd catch up on schoolwork, maybe watch a movie or two, and enjoy the solitude. It was just another Friday, or so I thought. The evening passed without incident. I made dinner for myself, nothing fancy, just a simple bowl of pasta. Afterward, I settled in on the couch, flipping through Netflix and trying to decide what to watch. It was the perfect kind of night, quiet, peaceful, and comfortable. Around 10 p.m., I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. I shook it off, blaming the low lighting in the house, the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me, or perhaps the wind outside. I had lived in this house my whole life. I should have known better than to let my imagination run wild. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't ignore it. A strange chill filled the room, and the air seemed heavier somehow, as if the house itself were breathing. It felt as though someone was watching me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't the kind of feeling that comes from hearing noises or seeing something out of place. It was the feeling of being observed, as though eyes were trained on me from the shadows. I got up from the couch, trying to shake off the feeling. I turned on the lights in the hallway as I made my way to the kitchen, hoping that would help ground me. But as I walked through the quiet house, something felt off. There was no breeze, but the air in the house was growing colder, and I noticed my breath coming out in small puffs. I chalked it up to an old house, drafty and unpredictable. But as I reached the kitchen, I saw it. The door to the basement was slightly ajar. The basement door had always been a bit creaky, and I remembered locking it earlier in the day when I'd gone down to grab some old books. It was a habit of mine, always locking the door behind me when I wasn't going to be using it. But now it was open, just enough for a sliver of dark space to peer through. My heart rate picked up, and the unease I had been feeling earlier grew sharper. I walked over to the door and pushed it open, my breath quickening with each step. The basement was dark, the faintest sliver of light from the kitchen spilling into the top of the stairs. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. I didn't understand. The light had worked the last time I used it. I stood there in the darkness for a moment, contemplating. Maybe the bulb had blown, or maybe it was just a glitch. But as I turned to leave, a low noise echoed up from the basement, a soft thump, as though something heavy had shifted. My pulse raced. I knew there was no one else in the house. I was alone. I checked the time on my phone. 10:45 p.m. What could it be? A rat? Something falling over in the basement? My curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously descended the stairs, phone flashlight in hand. The basement smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth, and the low light only made everything seem more foreboding. The steps creaked under my weight, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners. When I reached the bottom, I turned in a slow circle, trying to see anything that could explain the noise I had heard. But the basement was still. No rats, no movement, no signs of anything having been disturbed. I sighed, relieved that it was just my imagination running wild. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the stairs, the floor creaked behind me. I froze. It wasn't the usual sound of the house settling. This was deliberate, as though someone or something was walking. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty. The shadows seemed to grow darker in the corners, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me, standing just out of sight. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breath shallow, the air thick with tension. The sound of footsteps continued, but they weren't from the stairs. They were coming from the far corner of the basement near the old furnace. My phone's light flickered, casting long dancing shadows along the walls. I couldn't see anything clearly. I took a deep breath and backed up slowly, deciding that maybe it was time to call it a night. I didn't want to be here anymore, in this suffocating silence, surrounded by shadows that felt too real. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft whisper, as though someone was speaking directly into my ear. The words were muffled and I couldn't make them out, but they were unmistakable. It was a voice, a human voice. "Help me." I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was as empty as it had been when I entered. My heart slammed in my chest, and I bolted up the stairs, not bothering to check if the door was closed. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it again, my hands trembling. The house was silent, but it felt wrong, empty and cold in a way that didn't belong. I called my best friend, hoping that talking to someone would calm me down, but when she picked up, I could hear the panic in my own voice. I explained what had happened, but she was quick to tell me that it was probably nothing. "Just the house," she said. "Just the old house." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my room, my phone's flashlight beside me as I tried to calm my nerves. I told myself it was just a freak accident, old house, old pipes, and my mind playing tricks on me, but the whispering voice never left me. The house felt different now, colder, as though it was holding a secret. When my parents came home the next day, everything seemed normal. They had no idea what had happened the night before, but I couldn't forget it. The voice, the footsteps, the cold, empty feeling that lingered in every corner of the house, and to this day I still hear it sometimes, the faintest whisper just before I fall asleep, as though someone is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The house felt different that evening. Megan had been home alone before, countless times, but tonight was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her parents had gone out for the night to attend a concert, leaving her behind with the usual instructions: dinner, homework, and a strict curfew. Megan didn't mind. She was 19, perfectly capable of taking care of herself. The evening had started normally enough. She had taken a long shower, eaten her favorite meal, and settled on the couch with her phone, watching Netflix to pass the time. The rain began to fall softly against the windows, the gentle sound lulling her into a sense of calm. Yet, there was a nagging discomfort growing inside her. Something about the silence in the house seemed heavier than usual. The house itself was old, but not in a charming way. It was built in the 1950s, and the walls creaked when the wind picked up. The floorboards groaned as if the house itself were sighing with age. Megan had gotten used to these noises over the years, but tonight they seemed different, more deliberate. She dismissed the thought as her mind playing tricks on her, chalking it up to the storm outside, which always made things feel more unsettling. But then, just as she was about to reach for her phone again, she heard it. A soft knock. At first, she thought it was the wind, the way it rattled the windows in the old house. But then it came again, faint but unmistakable. A knock on the front door. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one was supposed to be coming by, and her parents hadn't mentioned anything about a visitor. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't heard. But something about the knock felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. She stood up, her heart hammering in her chest, and slowly walked toward the door. Her eyes were trained on the peephole, but when she looked through it, there was no one there. Confused and more than a little unnerved, Megan stepped back from the door. She checked the lock, firmly in place. No sign of forced entry. Nothing unusual. It was as if the knock had never happened. The house was still. Taking a deep breath, Megan went back to the living room and tried to focus on her show. She couldn't shake the unease, but she reasoned with herself. The wind was strong tonight, and maybe it had created some sort of illusion, making it sound like someone had knocked. But as the minutes passed, she couldn't stop glancing at the door, half expecting another knock. The hours crawled by, and the night deepened. Around midnight, Megan felt her eyelids grow heavy. She decided it was time to go to bed, though she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she walked up the stairs to her room, the house seemed to groan under her feet, the floor creaking in a way it hadn't before. The unsettling noises grew louder as she made her way down the hallway, and the feeling of being watched only intensified. She had to admit it. Something was wrong. But what? Megan turned to her bedroom door and froze. It was slightly ajar. She was sure she had closed it before. In fact, she was certain she had locked it behind her earlier when she had come downstairs. Yet now it was opened by a crack, as though someone had been inside. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice wavering, but no answer came. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She stepped closer, every instinct telling her to run, but she forced herself to push the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it. Everything was in its place, the bed neatly made, her desk covered with books. There was nothing unusual about the room, except for the coldness that seemed to seep from the walls. Megan's breath fogged in the air, and she shivered despite the warmth of her sweater. She reached for the light switch, but before she could flick it on, she heard it. A soft scrape. It came from the closet. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Megan's eyes darted toward the closet door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but the sound, the scraping, was unmistakable. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the closet. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to know what might be inside, but she had no choice. The scrape sounded again, louder this time, as if whatever was in there was trying to escape. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. There was no response, only the faint sound of something moving behind the door. Megan took a deep breath and, with shaking hands, reached for the knob. She opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest, revealing the dark emptiness inside. There was nothing there. No one. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped back, unable to comprehend what was happening. The air in the room felt thicker now, as if something was closing in around her. She could still hear the faint scraping sound, now coming from the walls themselves, the unmistakable sensation of something, or someone, moving within them. "Stop it," she whispered to herself, backing away from the closet and shutting the door with a forceful push. She locked her eyes on the window as though it might offer her some escape, but all she saw was the same dark, rain-soaked night outside. Max, who had been quietly sleeping at the foot of the bed, suddenly leaped up, barking furiously, his body rigid and tense. Megan turned in alarm, but Max was no longer focused on her. His eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, just beyond the bed, where shadows seemed to twist and shift unnaturally. He growled low in his throat, his hackles raised, and took a step toward the corner. "Max, what is it?" she whispered, but the dog didn't respond. He continued to stare at the corner, now growling more fiercely, as though something or someone was standing there just out of sight. Megan's breath caught in her throat, her skin prickling. She felt a presence, something dark, something watching. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped by the fear that gripped her. And then she saw it. A shadow, dark and shifting, moved across the corner of the room. It was barely perceptible, just a flicker at the edge of her vision, but it was there, undeniably there. Megan's pulse raced as the shadow seemed to grow larger, slowly creeping toward her. Max barked one final sharp bark and ran toward the door, scratching at it frantically. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward. She bolted for the door, flinging it open and running down the hallway without a second thought. She didn't stop until she was outside, standing on the wet porch, gasping for breath. The rain soaked her hair and clothes, but she didn't care. She couldn't go back inside, not like this. She texted her parents, her hands shaking, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. By the time they returned home, the storm had passed and the house was quiet again. But Megan never went back inside that night. She stayed with her aunt, and when she did return the next morning, everything appeared to be exactly as it had been, except for the lingering chill in the air. The house felt emptier now, and Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her outside. That something was still watching, waiting. Story end.
Story number 6.
I had always loved being home alone. It was a rare occurrence in our busy household, and I savored the silence. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and my younger sister was at a sleepover, so I had the entire house to myself. It felt like a luxury. No one to bother me, no one to argue with, just me and the peace of being alone. The first night went by uneventfully. I spent the evening watching movies, cooking dinner, and enjoying the solitude. When I finally went to bed, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the quiet stillness of the house. But the next morning, things started to feel different. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe it was my parents coming back earlier than expected. But when I checked my phone, I saw that it was still early in the morning, well before they were due back. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, coming from downstairs. I lay still, listening carefully, wondering if it could be my sister sneaking in early. But that didn't make sense. She would have called me first. I got up cautiously, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. I grabbed my phone, thinking I could use the flashlight just in case, and slowly made my way to the stairs. The house was eerily quiet now. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. I reached the top of the stairs and stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Should I go down and investigate? Should I call my parents? My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had grown up in this house, and I knew every creak and groan it made, but this felt different. It felt wrong. I took a deep breath and slowly started down the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was dimly lit by the early morning light filtering in through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room. Everything seemed normal, except for the stillness. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment, scanning the room for anything unusual. The front door was locked, and the windows were closed. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I checked the kitchen, then the living room, and finally made my way toward the hallway that led to the back door. That's when I saw it. A chair was overturned in the hallway, just outside the bathroom. I froze. I knew that chair had been upright when I went to bed the night before. My first thought was that maybe my sister had come home early and had been messing around, but that didn't make sense either. She wouldn't have just left without telling me. I bent down to pick up the chair, my hands shaking. As I did, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, musty smell in the air, something that reminded me of wet earth. It was overpowering, and it made my stomach churn. I looked around the hallway again, my pulse racing, but there was nothing else to indicate what might have caused the smell. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, and decided to check the back door. It was locked, just like it should have been, but as I turned to head back into the living room, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the doorway to the basement. I froze. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like a dark coat or jacket, but it was hard to make out details because the light from the hallway didn't reach the basement very well. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just too tired. But then the figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, like it was aware I was watching. My heart stopped in my chest, and I quickly turned and ran back toward the stairs, my feet pounding against the hardwood. I bolted up to my room, locked the door behind me, and sat on the bed, my breathing ragged. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was it a person? Was someone in the house? Or was it something else? My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. I grabbed my phone and called my parents. The call went straight to voicemail. I called again and then a third time, but each time I got the same result. My parents weren't answering. Panic set in. I quickly texted my best friend, telling her what had happened. She responded almost immediately, urging me to call the police. But something held me back. I didn't want to make a scene. What if it was nothing? What if I was just imagining things? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door and listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was outside. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, but nothing seemed to happen. The house was still. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had been too scared, that maybe it had just been a trick of the light or a strange dream that had carried over into my waking hours. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was overreacting, but then the whispers started. It was faint at first, like a breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. I stood frozen, straining to hear, and then the whisper came again. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, but it sounded like it was coming from right behind me. "Get out!" I felt my blood run cold. I didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. The voice was so close, like someone was standing right next to me, but when I looked around, there was no one. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I almost jumped out of my skin. It was a text from my best friend. "Call the police. I'm serious. Don't wait." I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I was terrified. I grabbed my keys, shoved my phone in my pocket, and ran out the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my friend's house. I spent the rest of the day there trying to calm down, but the sense of dread never left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with me, something that wasn't human. The next morning, I went back to my house with my parents. I was nervous, but I didn't want to be a coward. As we walked through the front door, everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. The house felt just like it always had, quiet, still, and safe. But when I reached the hallway, I saw it. The chair that had been overturned the night before was back in its place, but not upright, just like it should be. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me, not without proof. And even if I did tell them, what could they do? It wasn't like they could explain what had happened. I still don't know what it was. Whether it was just my imagination or something far darker. But I know one thing for sure. I never felt safe in that house again. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I was 16 when it happened, the night that would change the way I looked at my childhood home forever. It was a typical Friday evening. My parents had gone away for the weekend to visit some old friends in the city, and I was left at home with nothing but the quiet of our suburban neighborhood to keep me company. I was used to being alone in the house. It wasn't a big deal. It was a normal house in a normal neighborhood, with a perfectly unremarkable history. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up late watching Netflix, scrolling through social media, and ordering takeout. I had grown accustomed to being alone in the house. The creaks of the old floorboards and the random groans of the house settling didn't faze me. I had always found them comforting, a sign that the house was alive. My cat, Whiskers, kept me company as I drifted off to sleep. The second night, however, was different. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Whiskers, walking around on the hardwood floors, but then I remembered that I had closed my bedroom door before going to sleep, and there was no way for her to get in without me hearing her. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to hear more clearly. The footsteps continued, but they didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't the sound of a person walking normally, but something heavier, slower, dragging. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I sat there in the dark, frozen. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to my door. The door handle jiggled. I held my breath, praying it was just my imagination, but the handle turned. My door creaked open just a few inches. I waited in the stillness of the night, not daring to move. I didn't even breathe. But nothing happened. The door stayed ajar and the house remained eerily quiet. I eventually convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe the house settling. I turned on my side and tried to sleep, though I kept one eye open, just in case. Whiskers had jumped onto the bed by then, curling up beside me, and her soft purring was the only sound in the room. When I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal. The door was still cracked open slightly, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or that I'd been half dreaming. The rational part of me knew there was a logical explanation, even though I couldn't quite grasp it. But then the second night came. I was laying in bed, exhausted from a busy day at school. My eyes were heavy, and I could barely keep them open. I was just about to drift off when I heard it again, the footsteps. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. This time they were unmistakable. The sound of someone walking, but with a dragging, uneven pace. I could hear it clearly, coming from the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the same sound I'd heard the night before. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and quickly turned on the flashlight. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway, but there was no one there. Nothing moved, and the house was as still as it had been when I went to bed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Could someone have broken in? Was there some explanation that I wasn't considering? But none of it made sense. I would have heard something else. Voices, doors slamming, something. I cautiously stepped into the hallway, keeping my phone's flashlight pointed at the floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the small circle of brightness at my feet. I walked slowly toward the stairs, feeling a strange chill in the air. The air felt thick, like something was weighing it down. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The footsteps were right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, just the same as before. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I stepped back, almost tripping over my own feet, and hurried back into my room, slamming the door behind me. I locked it this time. The sound of my heartbeat was the only thing I could hear. I knew I should call the police, but something held me back. What would I even say? Someone's walking in my house, but I can't see them? It sounded insane. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the noise in my head, but I couldn't. The footsteps, the jiggling of the door handle, the cold air, it all felt too real to dismiss. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was daylight, and the house felt quieter than ever. Still, the sense of unease lingered. The next day, I decided to check the house. I started in the hallway, inspecting every corner and every room. I checked all the doors, making sure they were locked, and inspected the windows. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something was wrong. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That night, I was determined not to let fear get the best of me. I made myself comfortable on the couch, planning to watch a movie and stay up late. I figured that if I stayed awake, I wouldn't be as vulnerable to whatever was happening. Around midnight, I was in the middle of a film when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps. I froze. This time, I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, telling her that something was wrong with the house. I didn't care if she thought I was crazy. I needed someone to talk to. But as the phone rang, I heard it, the sound of something, or someone, moving across the floor behind me. I turned around slowly, my phone still pressed to my ear. The living room was empty and the footsteps had stopped. But the air felt suffocating, cold. A shadow crossed the doorway. I barely had time to react. The room plunged into complete darkness as the lights flickered and then went out altogether. My phone's flashlight illuminated the room just enough for me to see the shape that had moved in front of me, tall but featureless as though it was simply a shadow. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag, bolted out the front door, and ran to the neighbors. I didn't look back. The next morning, I returned to the house with the neighbor, only to find everything in perfect order. No signs of a break-in. No trace of anyone else having been there. My parents came home the next day, and I didn't even mention what had happened. I wasn't sure I could explain it myself. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what was in my house. But every time I stay home alone, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not really alone. The footsteps, the shadow, the cold. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, I still hear them. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was a Friday night in mid-November, and I was home alone. My parents had gone to visit some old friends in the city for the weekend, leaving me with an entire house to myself. I had always looked forward to these quiet weekends where I could relax, watch movies, and enjoy the peace and solitude of our house. But this time, something felt different. The night started normally. I cooked myself some dinner, a simple meal of pasta and garlic bread, and then settled in for a movie. The house was quiet, as it usually was when no one was around. I was used to the soft creaks of the floorboards and the occasional rattle of windows from the wind, but tonight the noises seemed amplified. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the evening went on, the unease started to settle in. Around 9 p.m., I began to feel a strange chill in the air. I tried to ignore it, but the temperature in the house seemed to drop inexplicably. I wrapped myself in a blanket and continued watching my movie, hoping the cold would subside. But then, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping noise. I turned the volume down on the TV to listen more closely. The sound came from upstairs, from the direction of my parents' bedroom. I stood up, straining my ears to make out what it was, but the noise stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling. It was an old house, and it had its share of odd sounds. But as the minutes ticked by, the tapping started again, louder this time. It was a rhythmic knocking, like someone was gently tapping their fingers against the wall. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I had lived in this house for years, and I had never heard anything like this before. My heart started to race as I slowly stood up and made my way toward the stairs. The hallway upstairs was dark, and the only light came from the small lamp in the living room. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, wondering if I should call my parents, but I didn't want to sound ridiculous. After all, it was probably just a mouse or something. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, a soft, distinct tapping coming from the top of the stairs. I felt a chill run down my spine as I turned on the light and began to climb the stairs. When I reached the top, the tapping stopped, and the silence felt heavy. I stood there for a moment, waiting to hear something else, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, and the door to my parents' room was closed. I walked down the hallway, glancing into the rooms as I passed, but everything was as it should be. Still, something didn't feel right. I felt a presence, an oppressive, invisible weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but as I turned back toward the stairs, I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow, fleeting and dark, moved across the hallway, vanishing before I could fully register it. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned on my heel and descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen, but I was certain I had seen something that shouldn't have been there. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I dialed my best friend, trying to ignore the lingering feeling of being watched. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice groggy. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "I think I'm freaking myself out, but I keep hearing weird noises in the house. Tapping, footsteps. I don't know, it feels like something's here." There was a pause on the other end. "You're just freaking out because you're alone. It's probably just the house settling or the wind. You've lived there for how long? It's fine." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. You're probably right. I'm just being dumb. We chatted for a few minutes, and I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But even after hanging up with her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the next few hours on the couch, trying to distract myself with TV. But the tapping noise continued, faint at first and then growing louder, always coming from the direction of my parents' bedroom. It was as though someone was pacing back and forth in the room, but every time I looked, nothing was there. By midnight, I was exhausted, but I didn't dare go upstairs again. The house felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the house with me. I turned off the TV and tried to sleep on the couch, hoping that the exhaustion would eventually lull me into a deep sleep. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows, made my eyes snap open. I lay there, wide awake, my heart racing, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing minute. At around 2 a.m., I heard the tapping again. This time it was unmistakable, coming from directly above me. The sound echoed down the stairs, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I couldn't stay down here anymore. I couldn't be in the house alone with whatever was making that noise. Slowly, I got up from the couch and grabbed my phone again. My hands trembled as I dialed my mom's number. It was late, but I didn't care. I needed to hear her voice. The phone rang twice before she picked up, sounding groggy but concerned. "Mom, something's wrong with the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I keep hearing noises. Tapping, footsteps. I don't know what it is, but I feel like someone's here." My mom sighed, her voice calm but tired. "Honey, I'm sure it's nothing. You're just alone in the house, and it's probably just the wind or the house settling. You've heard these noises before." I didn't respond. I didn't want to tell her that it wasn't just the wind or the house settling. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. It wasn't the sound of someone knocking from the outside. It was as if someone was knocking from the inside. On the door to the living room where I was sitting, I didn't move. I didn't dare to breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. I bolted from the room and ran to the front door. There was nothing outside. No one. The porch light illuminated the empty yard, and the street beyond was quiet. There was no sign of anyone. When I turned back to the house, the door to the living room was wide open. I hadn't opened it. No one had. The door had been shut when I left the room just moments ago. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house, not caring about anything else. I didn't look back, not even when the door slammed shut behind me. I spent the rest of the night at my neighbor's house, and by the time I returned home, the house was quiet. The tapping had stopped. The door was closed again. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the house wasn't gone. When my parents came home the next day, I told them everything. They listened, but they didn't believe me. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," my mom said. "You're fine now, right?" But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. And I still can't shake the feeling that something is there, in that house, waiting for the next time I'm alone.
Story number 9.
It was a quiet Thursday night when Ethan found himself alone in the house. His parents had left that morning for a work conference and wouldn't be back until Saturday evening. At 24, Ethan was no stranger to staying home alone, but there was something about the house that night that felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the stillness or the way the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Or maybe it was the fact that the power had flickered twice already, even though the weather wasn't severe enough to warrant it. Ethan dismissed the unease as his imagination. After all, he had plans to make the most of his time alone, watch a horror movie marathon, order takeout, and stay up late. The house, a 2-story suburban home surrounded by large maple trees, had always been his sanctuary. There was no reason to feel uneasy. By 9 p.m., the living room was bathed in the glow of the television. Ethan sat on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, deeply engrossed in a movie. He was halfway through a particularly tense scene when he heard the sound, a faint knock. It was coming from somewhere upstairs. He paused the movie, the eerie background music fading into silence. He sat still, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then it came again. 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Ethan frowned, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the window, or the house settling. He turned the volume down on the TV and waited, but the sound didn't come back. Shaking his head, he resumed the movie. 10 minutes later, the sound came again, this time louder. It wasn't a knock anymore, it was a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor directly above him. His chest tightened as he muted the TV again. The sound continued, slow and deliberate. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight app, the bright beam cutting through the dim room. He didn't want to investigate, but his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a kitchen knife for good measure and made his way upstairs. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, except for the faint light spilling out of his bedroom. The dragging sound had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Ethan checked his parents' room first, empty. The guest room was the same, nothing out of place. Finally, he reached his own room. The door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking. The room was just as he'd left it, clothes scattered on the floor, his laptop open on the desk, and the bed unmade. He stepped inside, shining his flashlight into every corner. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then he heard it, a whisper, soft and barely audible but unmistakable. "Ethan." His blood ran cold. The whisper came from behind him. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the room, but there was no one there. His breathing quickened as he backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him. He didn't care if he looked foolish. He called out into the empty house. "Who's there?" The only response was the faint creak of a floorboard at the end of the hallway. Ethan's grip tightened on the knife as he crept toward the noise. The attic door loomed above him, the pull cord swaying gently as if it had just been disturbed. He stared at it, his stomach churning. There was no way he was going up there. As if on cue, the power went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, and the silence became suffocating. Ethan's flashlight was the only source of light, its beam trembling as his hand shook. He stepped back toward the stairs, his instincts screaming at him to get out of the house. That's when he heard the voice again. This time, it was louder, clearer. "Ethan." It was coming from the attic. He didn't think. He ran, down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door. He didn't stop until he was standing in the middle of the driveway, his breath coming in gasps. The cold night air stung his skin, but he didn't care. He dialed his best friend, Mark, his fingers trembling so badly he almost dropped the phone. "Ethan? What's up, man?" Mark's voice was casual, unaware of the terror gripping his friend. "Mark," Ethan whispered, his voice shaky, "there's something in the house." "What? Are you serious?" "I'm not joking. Something's in the attic." Mark hesitated. "Are you sure? It's probably just... I heard my name, Mark. Something called my name." That silenced Mark. "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." Ethan paced the driveway, his eyes fixed on the house. The attic window was dark, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him. He felt exposed under the streetlight, but there was no way he was going back inside. When Mark arrived 15 minutes later, he found Ethan sitting on the curb, his face pale and his hands still clutching the knife. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mark said, stepping out of his car. He glanced at the house. "Are you sure you're not imagining things?" "I know what I heard," Ethan said. "You don't have to believe me. Just help me check it out." Reluctantly, Mark agreed. Together, they went back inside, Ethan gripping the flashlight and Mark holding a heavy wrench he'd grabbed from his car. The house was eerily quiet, the air feeling colder than before. They made their way upstairs, the flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The attic door was still swaying, the pull cord twisting lazily. Mark gave Ethan a skeptical look before grabbing the cord and yanking it down. The wooden ladder unfolded with a groan. Mark climbed up first, the flashlight in his hand illuminating the cramped space. Ethan followed, his heart hammering in his chest. The attic was filled with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and layers of dust. At first glance, it seemed empty. But as they stepped further inside, Mark froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing to the far corner. Ethan followed his gaze. There in the corner was a small pile of items that didn't belong. A child's doll with one missing eye, an old picture frame with the glass shattered, and a single dirty shoe. But what made Ethan's blood turn to ice was the photograph in the frame. It was of him, taken years ago during a family trip. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, stepping closer. Before Ethan could respond, the attic door slammed shut below them. Both men jumped, their flashlight beams swinging wildly. And then the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing around them. "Ethan." The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, they saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the attic, its features indistinct but its presence oppressive. Ethan felt a wave of cold wash over him, and his legs buckled. "Go!" Mark shouted, shoving Ethan toward the ladder. They scrambled down, nearly falling in their panic. The house felt alive now, the walls groaning as if something were moving within them. They didn't stop running until they were outside, slamming the front door behind them. Ethan never spent another night in that house. His parents didn't believe him when he told them what had happened, but he didn't care. He moved out a month later, leaving the house and whatever was in it behind. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I was never the type to scare easily. Growing up, I loved watching horror movies, always boasting that nothing could ever get to me. But that night, alone in the house, I learned just how wrong I could be. It was a Friday evening when my parents left for a weekend trip, leaving me in charge of the house. My younger brother was staying at a friend's house for the weekend, so I was alone in the large, creaky house we'd lived in for years. I had always liked the house. It was old, with hardwood floors that creaked underfoot, and the air always seemed to have a faint chill to it. I never thought much of it. In fact, I loved the quiet. My parents were always working, and my brother was, my brother, loud and rowdy. It felt like a rare chance to relax. That night, after settling into my usual routine, I watched a few episodes of a TV show I'd been binging. The house was so quiet it felt like it was holding its breath. Around midnight, I decided to turn off the TV and go to bed. The house was completely dark except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. As I made my way upstairs, I passed the hallway mirror on the landing. I didn't think much of it. It was just a reflection of the empty house. But something made me stop for a moment. I stared at the mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow moving behind me. My heart raced, and I quickly glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired, and went to my room. I had barely settled into bed when I heard it. A soft creak. Then another. It was coming from downstairs. I sat up, listening. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old houses made noises like that, but the creaks were too deliberate, too close together. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. The creaking continued, faint at first, then louder. It sounded like footsteps. Someone walking across the floor in the hallway downstairs. My heart began to pound in my chest. My first thought was that maybe it was my brother sneaking back into the house without telling me, but that didn't make sense. He wasn't supposed to be home. I texted him just to be sure, but there was no response. I tried to call him, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. The footsteps stopped. Then after a few seconds, I heard something else. A soft tapping on the floor, like nails against wood. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the house settling. There was no other explanation. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I forced myself to get out of bed and walk toward the stairs. The house felt cold, colder than usual, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I crept down the hallway toward the stairs, my footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. I paused at the top of the stairs, straining to listen. The house was dead quiet now. I held my breath, hoping for some sign of what was going on. Nothing. I slowly descended the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lights outside. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood still for a moment. I could feel the air around me, heavy, oppressive. I checked the living room. Nothing, no signs of anything unusual. The kitchen was just as I had left it, empty, quiet. I checked the windows, making sure they were locked. They were. I was about to head back upstairs when I heard a faint sound behind me. A whisper, a voice, low and distant. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman's voice. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was no one there. My pulse raced, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I was alone in the house. There was no one here. I hurried back up the stairs, practically running, and shut the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind was racing. I couldn't explain what had just happened. There had to be a logical explanation. I grabbed my phone again and texted my mom. "Are you guys okay? Everything's fine?" The reply came almost instantly. "We're good, just relaxing." "Why?" I paused, staring at the text. The reply was normal. My parents were fine, but my gut told me something was wrong. Something was in the house with me. I heard a sound again, this time from my room. A soft tap. 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 I froze, staring at the door. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside my room. Slowly, I turned the doorknob, trying to make as little noise as possible. I cracked the door open just a sliver. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was a shadow, almost indistinct, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It stood perfectly still, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I was seeing. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I quickly closed the door, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I turned on the lights and sat on my bed, staring at the door. There was no way I had imagined that. It had been too real, too vivid. The tap, tap, tap started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get my attention. The sound came from the other side of the room, and I could hear it moving closer. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my brother. "I'm back home. Just got in. Everything okay?" I texted back quickly. "Are you sure? You're not in the house?" He replied immediately. "What do you mean? I'm home, but I'm in my room." I took a deep breath and walked toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened it. My room was empty. There was no shadow, no figure, no tapping, just the usual mess of clothes and books scattered across the floor. I turned around, breathing heavily. What was going on? A faint sound came from downstairs again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Slowly, like something heavy was being moved from room to room. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my phone, ran downstairs, and threw open the front door. I didn't even bother with shoes, just ran out into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I reached the neighbor's house, out of breath and in tears. The neighbors called the police for me. They searched the house top to bottom. No one was there. Nothing had been disturbed. The house was empty. When my parents came home, I tried to tell them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just scared, imagining things in the dark. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. The tapping never stopped. It still happens from time to time, but now I'm never alone in the house. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
It was a late Friday evening when I found myself home alone. My parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me in the comfort of our old house, nestled at the edge of the woods. I'd grown used to being alone here, and while the house was over a century old, it didn't bother me. It creaked and moaned like any house of its age, but there was a familiarity to it. The thick wooden beams in the ceiling, the way the windows rattled in the wind, and the old furnace that hissed every time it kicked on. All of these sounds were part of the landscape I had grown up with. I had no reason to feel uneasy, at least not until that night. I had spent the evening watching a movie and eating some takeout. By midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, locked the front door, and went upstairs to my room. The house was eerily quiet now, the only sound being occasional gust of wind against the windows. I'd lived here for years and had never been particularly scared of it, but tonight, something felt different. I made my way to the bathroom to wash my face. As I stood in front of the mirror, I couldn't help but notice a strange sensation, as though I was being watched. The feeling was faint at first, but it grew stronger the longer I stood there. My skin prickled, and I felt a sudden cold draft sweep through the room. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but it was empty. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. When I finished and headed back to my room, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the house felt off. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. After all, I was alone, and the silence was probably playing tricks on me. I climbed into bed, trying to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. But then I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from downstairs. I froze, my phone still in my hand. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but the tapping was rhythmic, almost deliberate. My heart began to race. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch hitting the window or the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was something else. I lay there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound persisted. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from the kitchen. I strained my ears, listening for any other noise, but everything else was dead silent. The tapping stopped for a moment, and in the quiet, I heard another noise. A faint shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. No one else was in the house. My parents had left hours ago, and the only other being here was our cat, Luna, but I hadn't heard meowing or even scratching at the door. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I check? Should I call someone? But who could I call? I wasn't a little kid anymore. I should have been brave enough to handle this on my own. After a long pause, I finally pulled myself out of bed, trying to ignore the anxiety gnawing at my stomach. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed down the hall, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I reached the top of the stairs, and that's when I saw it. The kitchen light was on. I knew I had turned it off before going upstairs, but now it was glowing softly from below. My heart pounded as I descended the stairs, each step feeling like it was echoing through the house. As I reached the bottom, I looked into the kitchen. It was empty. The faint tapping sound started again, this time from the direction of the pantry. My pulse quickened. I slowly walked toward the kitchen, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. The tapping was now accompanied by a soft rustling, like someone shifting something around. I reached the pantry door and stopped. My hand hovered over the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Then the door swung open on its own. I jumped back, my heart racing as I stumbled into the wall. The pantry was empty. There was nothing inside but shelves of canned goods and boxes of pasta. But something was wrong. The air felt cold, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It was as if the space was charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I backed away, but just as I turned to leave the kitchen, I heard it again, the soft scraping of something across the floor. It came from the living room, as if someone was slowly dragging a heavy object along the hardwood. I bolted out of the kitchen, my legs trembling beneath me, and I crept into the living room. The room was empty, save for the furniture. The windows were locked, and the door was still securely shut. But then I noticed it, something I hadn't seen before. The old rocking chair near the fireplace was gently rocking back and forth. I hadn't touched it. No one had. I never even sat in that chair. I moved closer, my breath shallow and quick. The creaking of the chair was unnerving, but I couldn't stop myself from approaching it. I reached out a hand and, as if on cue, the chair stopped rocking and the temperature in the room dropped even further. Suddenly, I heard a voice. A whisper so faint, I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it or if it was just my imagination. Help me. The voice was so soft, almost a breath, that I could barely make it out. But it was there, clear as day. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the overwhelming urge to run. I turned to leave, but as I reached the doorway, the front door slammed shut with a force so violent that it shook the walls. The sound was deafening, and I gasped, stumbling back. I ran to the door, my hands fumbling to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. Panic surged through me as I slammed my shoulder against the door, trying to break free. My phone was still in my pocket, but I couldn't even think straight enough to call anyone. I was alone, locked inside a house that suddenly felt like a trap. The whispering voice came again. Help me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath in the air. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for any of this to be happening, but it was. The chair rocking, the voice, the door that wouldn't open. Everything pointed to something that I couldn't see, something that didn't belong. I gathered all my courage and tried again to open the door. This time, it gave way, and I stumbled out into the night air. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, barely able to catch my breath. They let me in, and I spent the night there, too terrified to go back. The next morning, when I finally returned to my house, everything seemed normal. The front door was wide open, just as I had left it. There were no signs of forced entry, and the house was silent once more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, that something had been waiting for me. And no matter how many times I told myself it was just my imagination, the whispering voice haunted me. I never spent another night alone in that house. Story the end.
Story number 12.
The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears and made the slightest creak sound like a gunshot. Julia sat in the living room, her phone in hand, scrolling mindlessly through social media. Her parents had left for the weekend, trusting her to watch the house while they visited her grandparents. She had assured them she'd be fine. After all, she was 17, not a child. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled outside. It was a typical October storm, the kind that made everything feel a little more sinister. Julia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and shifted on the couch. Her golden retriever, Max, lay at her feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of the storm. As she settled in to watch a movie, a faint sound drew her attention. It was subtle, almost like a whisper coming from upstairs. She muted the TV and listened. Nothing. Probably just the wind, she thought, shaking her head. But then it came again, a low, almost rhythmic creak. It sounded like footsteps. Her heart began to race. Max lifted his head, ears perked, and stared at the staircase. His low growl made her stomach twist. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Houses made noises, especially old ones like theirs. Still, the unease in her chest refused to fade. She grabbed her phone and texted her best friend, Lily. "Hey, something weird's happening. I think I'm freaking myself out." Lily replied almost instantly. "What do you mean? Weird how?" Before Julia could answer, the creaking upstairs started again. This time it was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps as if someone was walking back and forth in her parents' bedroom. "Max," she whispered, gripping his collar. The dog's growl deepened, his hackles raised. She debated calling her parents but didn't want to alarm them for no reason. Instead, she grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly ascended the stairs, Max at her side. The second floor was dark, the hallway bathed in shadows. The door to her parents' room was ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling out. Her heart pounded as she approached. She pushed the door open wider with trembling fingers, shining the flashlight inside. The room was empty. The wind rattled the window pane, and the faint scent of her mother's lavender perfume lingered in the air. Julia exhaled shakily, feeling a mix of relief and foolishness. She turned to leave when Max barked sharply, his eyes fixed on the closet. "Stop it," she whispered, trying to steady her voice. But Max didn't stop. He stood rigid, barking and growling at the closed door. Julia's mouth went dry. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for the closet knob. The air felt colder now, the kind of chill that settled in your bones. She held her breath and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just clothes, shoes, and a few old boxes. She let out a nervous laugh and scratched Max behind the ears. "See? Nothing to worry about." But Max didn't relax. He whined softly, his eyes darting toward the corner of the room. Julia turned her flashlight in that direction and froze. There, in the mirror of her mother's antique vanity, was a shadow. It wasn't her reflection. It was taller, its shape distorted, as if someone else were standing there. The figure tilted its head, and though it had no eyes, she felt it staring at her. The flashlight flickered, and the room grew impossibly cold. Julia stumbled backward, grabbing Max's collar. The shadow in the mirror seemed to lean closer, its indistinct form rippling like smoke. Then, just as suddenly, the flashlight went out, plunging the room into darkness. Julia screamed, yanking Max and running down the stairs. She tripped on the last step and hit the floor hard, but she didn't stop. She bolted for the front door, her hands fumbling with the lock. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. The door finally gave way, and she and Max burst outside into the storm. Rain soaked her instantly, but she didn't care. She ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until Mrs. Carter answered, her expression alarmed. "Julia? What's going on?" "There's someone in the house," Julia cried, clutching Max's leash. Mrs. Carter didn't hesitate. She pulled Julia inside and called the police. When the officers arrived, They searched the house thoroughly but found no sign of an intruder. They assured Julia it was probably just her imagination, heightened by the storm. But as they left, one of the officers, an older man with a kind face, pulled her aside. "You sure there's no one else in your family who's been here recently? No visitors?" Julia shook her head. "No. Why?" The officer hesitated. "When we checked the upstairs bedroom, there were footprints, wet ones, leading from the closet to the stairs." Julia felt her stomach drop. She didn't sleep that night, even after Mrs. Carter offered to let her stay. Max wouldn't leave her side, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The next day, her parents returned, and Julia told them everything. Her dad dismissed it as a bad dream, but her mom's face grew pale. She later confessed that strange things had happened in the house before, things she hadn't wanted to mention for fear of scaring Julia. The house was never the same after that. Julia often felt like she was being watched, and Max refused to go upstairs. Her parents eventually sold the house, but Julia never forgot that night. And sometimes in her dreams, she still saw the shadow in the mirror, tilting its head as if waiting for her to return. Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was the first time Rachel had been left home alone for more than a night. Her parents were celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary on a weekend getaway, leaving her in charge of the house. At 19, she welcomed the opportunity to have the place to herself. She wasn't the type to throw a party, but the quiet freedom was appealing. Their house was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees and fields that stretched for miles. It wasn't isolated exactly, but the nearest neighbor was far enough that if you screamed, no one would hear you. Rachel wasn't one to spook easily, though. She was practical, level-headed, and enjoyed the solitude. It was Saturday evening when things started to feel off. The day had passed uneventfully, with Rachel catching up on her favorite TV shows and reading on the couch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she noticed how the house seemed to change with the darkness. Shadows stretched further, and every little creak of the wooden floors seemed amplified. She dismissed it. The house was old. Old houses made noise. She had just finished dinner when she heard the first sound. It was faint, like a soft knock, coming from somewhere upstairs. Rachel paused, her fork hovering midair. The house was silent again, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Shrugging, she cleared the table and decided to check her phone while washing the dishes. She texted her mom to let her know everything was fine and sent a Snapchat to her best friend, Sarah, who replied almost instantly. "Enjoying the Haunted Mansion vibes yet?" Rachel rolled her eyes and responded, "You're not funny. It's just creaky." She was halfway through the dishes when the sound came again. This time it was louder, a distinct thump from above. Her hands froze in the soapy water. She tilted her head, listening. It could have been the wind or maybe something falling over in one of the bedrooms. But the sound was deliberate, heavy, like a footstep. Her heart picked up speed, but she forced herself to breathe. She grabbed the dish towel, wiped her hands dry, and headed to the stairs. Her phone was in her pocket, just in case. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady but soft. She winced at how loud her voice sounded in the stillness. No response. She climbed the stairs slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the carpeted steps. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by the small nightlight her parents always kept on. All the doors were closed, just as she had left them, but something felt wrong. The air was heavier, colder. Rachel hesitated, her fingers brushing against her phone. She didn't want to call anyone and sound ridiculous, but her nerves were fraying. She opened the door to her parents' bedroom and sat, flicking on the light. Everything was as it should be. Bed neatly made, curtains drawn, nothing out of place. She closed the door and moved to the guest room. Same thing, empty, untouched. Her own room was last. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her heart pounding for no reason she could explain. The room was just as she'd left it. Messy bed, laptop open on her desk, clothes scattered on the chair. She let out a shaky laugh. "See, you're being paranoid," she whispered to herself. She turned off the light and stepped back into the hallway. That's when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic creak. It was coming from the end of the hallway where the attic door was. The attic was rarely used, just a crawl space with old boxes and Christmas decorations. The door was a pull-down hatch with a wooden ladder that unfolded. Rachel stared at it, her stomach tightening. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing directly above her. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. The creaking stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. It pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. She took a step backward, her eyes locked on the attic door. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed the pull cord and yanked it down. The ladder unfolded with a groan. Rachel held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She leaned forward slightly, and Enriquez peering into the darkness above. Her phone's flashlight wasn't strong enough to reach the far corners, but from what she could see, the attic was empty. Just as she was about to pull the ladder back up, she heard a whisper. It wasn't clear, just a soft, guttural sound that made her skin crawl. Her grip on the ladder tightened as she leaned closer, straining to hear. The whisper came again, louder this time and unmistakable. It was her name, Rachel. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her phone slipped from her pocket and hit the floor with a loud clatter. The light from the screen illuminated the attic opening, and for a split second, she thought she saw something move. A shadow, darting out of sight. Rachel didn't wait. She grabbed her phone, shoved the ladder back into place, and bolted down the stairs. She locked herself in the living room, her back pressed against the door, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her first instinct was to call her parents, but what could they do? They were hours away. Sarah. She called Sarah instead, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. "Rachel?" Sarah answered after the first ring. "What's wrong?" I think there's someone in the house," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "What? Are you serious? Did you call the police?" "No, I don't know if it's a person," Rachel said, her throat dry. "It's something." Sarah was silent for a moment. "Stay on the line. I'm coming over." Rachel sat on the couch, her eyes darting around the room. The TV was still paused on the show she'd been watching earlier, the cheerful image a stark contrast to the dread settling in her stomach. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Then, just as Sarah texted to say she was 5 minutes away, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from her phone. She turned on the flashlight, sweeping it around the room. That's when she saw it. A figure, standing at the base of the stairs. It was barely visible, a shadow darker than the rest of the room. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she could feel it staring at her. The air grew colder, and her chest tightened as if an invisible hand were pressing down on her. "Sarah," she whispered into the phone, "please hurry. I'm almost there. Just stay calm, okay? I'm pulling into your driveway." The shadow took a step forward. Rachel screamed, bolting for the front door. She yanked it open just as Sarah's car screeched to a stop in front of the house. Sarah jumped out, running toward her. "What happened?" "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, grabbing her shoulders. "It's in there," Rachel gasped, her voice trembling. "There's something in the house." Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the open door. The house was dark and still. "Are you sure?" Before she could finish, the front door slammed shut on its own. Both girls screamed, stumbling back. Rachel's phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text. It was from her own number. "Don't come back." Story the end.
Story number 14.
The house sat at the edge of the woods, a modest 2-story structure with white siding and a wraparound porch. It wasn't particularly old, but it had that quiet stillness that came from being isolated. Lucy had always found it peaceful, especially when her parents were away on one of their weekend getaways. She enjoyed the solitude. No siblings, no responsibilities, just her and the silence. That Friday evening, as her parents headed out, Lucy waved them off and locked the door behind her. The autumn sky was already fading into twilight, painting the yard in deep orange and shadowy purples. She turned on the porch light, then went inside to make herself comfortable. A bowl of popcorn, a glass of soda, and her favorite horror movie queued up on the TV. It was her perfect night in. By the time the movie reached its first jump scare, the sun had completely set and the house was shrouded in darkness, except for the flickering glow of the screen. The wind outside was picking up, rustling the trees and occasionally making the windows rattle. Lucy barely noticed, too engrossed in the story unfolding on the television. But then there was a sound. It wasn't the wind or the movie. It was distinct, a low thud, like something heavy had fallen upstairs. Lucy paused the movie, her heart skipping a beat as she strained to listen. The house groaned in the silence, its wooden frame adjusting to the cooler night air. Another thud, this time sharper. It was coming from her parents' bedroom, directly above her. Probably nothing, she muttered to herself, though her voice was shaky. Maybe something fell off the dresser. She tried to ignore it, pressing play on the movie and turning the volume up a notch. But a minute later, the sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak like footsteps. Lucy froze, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. Then, as if sensing her attention, they resumed, this time moving toward the top of the stairs. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the ceiling, her mind racing. She hadn't heard anyone come into the house. The doors were locked, and she was sure she was alone. Her phone was on the coffee table. She grabbed it and dialed her mom, her fingers trembling. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried her dad's number, same result. She set the phone down and debated calling the police. But what would she say? That she heard footsteps in a locked house? The creaking continued, descending the staircase slowly, step by step. Lucy's breath hitched as she stood and backed away from the living room, toward the kitchen. Her hand found the countertop, and she gripped it tightly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She glanced at the knife block and hesitated for only a moment before pulling out the largest one. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The house fell deathly silent. Lucy clutched the knife, her eyes darting between the kitchen doorway and the living room. She had nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response, just the sound of her own breathing. Then from the living room came a sound that sent chills down her spine, the faint creak of the rocking chair, the one her mother always sat in. It had been still for hours, untouched, but now it was moving, swaying back and forth in slow, deliberate motions. Lucy's grip on the knife tightened as she peeked around the corner. The chair was indeed rocking, its rhythmic motion almost hypnotic, but the room was empty. No one was sitting in it. She wanted to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another, until she was standing in the archway to the living room. The rocking chair slowed and stopped. The house was silent once more. A faint knock came from the front door. Lucy nearly screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. The knock came again, louder this time. She forced herself to move, creeping toward the door and peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. Silence. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table and she jumped, nearly dropping the knife. She grabbed the phone and checked the screen. It was a text from her mom. "Everything okay?" Her fingers flew over the keyboard. "I think someone's in the house. I'm scared. What do I do?" She waited, her eyes darting nervously toward the staircase. The reply came quickly. "Call the police. Stay where you are. We're coming home now." Lucy felt a small surge of relief, but knew it would be at least an hour before her parents could get back. She hesitated, then dialed 911. The operator's calm voice helped steady her nerves as she explained the situation. They assured her an officer was on the way and told her to stay on the line. But as she stood there, something caught her eye. The rocking chair, still and silent moments ago, was now moving again. Faster this time. She stared, unable to look away, as the chair began to creak violently, as if someone were slamming it against the floor. Her phone slipped from her hand, and the operator's voice became a distant murmur. Then the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. Lucy scrambled to pick up her phone, using its flashlight to sweep the room. The chair had stopped rocking. Everything was still. She heard a low whisper. It came from the staircase. Her breath hitched as she turned the light toward the stairs. At the top stood a figure, shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, with long, spindly limbs. It tilted its head as though observing her. Lucy couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The figure began to descend, one slow step at a time. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. That sound seemed to break her paralysis. She turned and ran, sprinting out the back door and into the yard. The cold air stung her lungs as she gasped for breath, her bare feet crunching on the gravel path. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the woods. From the safety of the trees, she turned back toward the house. The windows were dark, except for one, the living room. A single light flickered there, illuminating the rocking chair. In it sat the shadowy figure, swaying gently back and forth. Lucy stayed there until the police arrived. They searched the house from top to bottom but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. Just an empty rocking chair in a silent living room. Her parents returned that night, shaken but relieved she was unharmed. They insisted it must have been her imagination, the stress of being alone in a big house. But Lucy knew what she had seen. She knew she hadn't been alone. She never stayed home alone again. Story the end.
Story number 15.
It was a quiet Friday evening when 22-year-old Emily found herself home alone for the weekend. Her parents had left that morning for a trip to visit her aunt in another state, and her younger brother was away at a friend's house for a sleepover. Emily didn't mind. She relished the rare chance to have the house to herself. Their house was a modest 2-story home in a sleepy neighborhood, surrounded by a thin line of woods at the back. The neighbors were close enough to wave to, but far enough that the sounds of daily life didn't carry. It was peaceful. Maybe too peaceful, Emily thought as the sun began to set. By 9 p.m., the sky outside was ink black. Emily was curled up on the couch in the living room, a blanket draped over her legs, the soft glow of the TV illuminating the space. She was halfway through a suspenseful murder mystery when she heard it, a soft thud from upstairs. She froze, the remote in her hand hovering midair. She muted the TV and listened. Silence. Emily shook her head. The house was old, and old houses made noise. Maybe something had fallen off her desk in her room, or maybe it was just the pipes. She unmuted the TV and tried to focus on the movie. But then it came again, this time louder, like a muffled footstep. Emily's heart began to race. She paused the movie and sat still, her ears straining. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard above her. Someone, or something, was walking upstairs. Her immediate thought was an intruder. But how? All the doors were locked, and the windows had been shut all day. She grabbed her phone and dialed her dad, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried her mom. No luck. The same for her brother. Taking a deep breath, she got up and walked to the base of the stairs, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest as the seconds stretched on. She shook her head and took a step back. She was being ridiculous. She'd go upstairs, check everything, and then laugh at how silly she'd been. Grabbing the heavy flashlight her dad kept in the closet, Emily started up the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. At the top, she flicked on the hall light, and the familiar space seemed suddenly foreign. The first room she checked was her parents'. It was exactly as they'd left it. Bed made, curtains drawn, nothing out of place. Next was her brother's room. His desk was cluttered with schoolwork and video game controllers, and his bed was unmade, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Finally, Emily stepped into her own room. Everything looked normal. Her desk was piled with textbooks, her laptop was charging on the nightstand, and her bed was just as she'd left it. She let out a shaky laugh. "See? You're just paranoid," she said to herself. She turned to leave, but as she did, she caught sight of something in her mirror. A shadow, just a flicker, darting behind her. Emily spun around, her flashlight cutting through the room, but there was nothing there. She stared at the empty space where she thought she'd seen movement, her stomach knotting. It had to have been a trick of the light. She turned off the flashlight and headed back downstairs, convincing herself it was nothing. The rest of the evening was uneventful. Emily locked the doors again, double-checked the windows, and curled up on the couch, determined to finish her movie. By the time it ended, she felt foolish for letting her imagination get the best of her. She turned off the TV and headed to bed. It was 2:34 a.m. when she woke up. At first, she wasn't sure why. The house was silent, and her room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. She lay there staring at the ceiling until she heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Emily's blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from downstairs. Her phone was on the nightstand. She grabbed it, her fingers shaking as she unlocked it and opened the flashlight app. She tiptoed to her bedroom door and pressed her ear against it. The scraping sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the hardwood floor. Her first instinct was to call the police, but what would she say? That she thought she heard something downstairs. What if it turned out to be nothing? She decided to investigate. She grabbed the baseball bat her brother kept in his room and quietly made her way downstairs. As she descended the stairs, the sound stopped. The living room was dark and eerily still. Emily's eyes darted around the space, the beam of her flashlight sweeping over the furniture. Everything looked normal. And then she saw it. The back door was wide open, the cool night air seeping into the house. Emily's heart nearly stopped. She was sure she'd locked it before going to bed. Slowly, she approached the door, gripping the bat tightly. She shone the flashlight into the backyard, but all she saw was darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the lawn. She closed the door and locked it again, her hands trembling. Turning back toward the living room, she froze. The dining chairs had been moved. All 6 of them were now lined up in a row, facing the front door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She hadn't heard the chairs move. There was no way anyone could have done this without her hearing it. And yet, there they were. Then she heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the kitchen. Emily backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whisper grew louder, though she couldn't make out the words. It was low and guttural, like someone speaking from deep within their chest. She didn't wait to find out what it was. She bolted for the front door, flinging it open and running into the night. She didn't stop until she was halfway down the street, her heart pounding and her breath coming in gasps. From the safety of a neighbor's porch, Emily called the police. When they arrived, she explained everything, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. 2 officers searched the house thoroughly but found no one. They reassured her it was likely a prank or her imagination, but Emily knew better. She didn't sleep in the house that night, or the next. When her parents returned, they dismissed her story as nerves or a bad dream, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been alone that night, and she never stayed home alone again. Story, the end.